This is Tim O'Brien reporting from Seattle on November 4th, 2025. And for today's news. Today's security story, the U.S. traces ransomware attacks to two people working for cybersecurity firms. And this is a report by Michael Cann at PC Mag. Two cybersecurity employees allegedly used their insider access to deploy Black Cat ransomware to at least 5 companies. The scheme ran from May 2023 to April 2025, with the pair demanding millions and collecting at least $1.2 million from one victim. According to the indictment, one suspect confessed to the FBI that he conducted the attacks to get out of debt, and he also expected to go to federal prison for the rest of his life. This is the ultimate insider threat, when the people hired to protect you are the ones attacking you. These weren't external hackers. They were trusted cybersecurity professionals using their legitimate access to deploy ransomware. So today's reminder, your adversary might also work for you. For more information and to read Michael Cann's story, see the link in the show notes. Today's programming story is a little easier than that security story. It's a CSS-only terrain generator. And you can see it at layoutit.com. That's layoutit.com, terra.layoutit.com. It's from Layoutit Studio. It creates a 3D voxel terrain using only CSS grids and transforms. So it looks like a Minecraft map. There's no JavaScript, there's no WebGL or Canvas. It features full terrain editing. You can raise and lower the mountains and different biomes, Arctic, desert, temperate, and it has real-time camera controls. So you can actually fly through a terrain using only CSS. And this is very interesting. It just shows you that you can do 3D rendering without having to use JavaScript or other languages or things like WebAssembly. It's very interesting. If you want more information, you can see the link in the show notes. Our Weird Bucket story is the first recording of a dying human brain shows waves similar to memory flashbacks. And this is from Dr. Ajmal Zenmar at the University of Louisville School of Medicine. Scientists accidentally recorded 900 seconds of brain activity from an 87-year-old patient who died during EEG monitoring. The dying brain showed gamma oscillations, brain waves linked to memory retrieval, dreaming, and meditation, in the 30 seconds before and after the heart stopped. This suggests that the brain is playing a last recall of important life events. It's similar to the reports you hear from near-death experiences of life flashing before your eyes. Why it's also interesting is that the activity happened after the heart stopped. So today's Weird Bucket story is very heavy. If you want more information about this and what they measured, see the show notes. That's today's news, but there's still a little bit more to cover. X, formerly Twitter, is silently opening any tweet link in a web view, whether you click it or not. A user named StillAtIt discovered this today when an e-commerce site's traffic suddenly tripled. So what this means is that if you run a website and you've noticed a massive increase in traffic, it could be this. What X is doing here is they're loading the content of that URL in a web view behind the scenes. And they're doing it before someone clicks on that link. So just take a look at your traffic today, and this might be what you're looking for in terms of an explanation. In other security news, the Isuru botnet has pivoted from DDoS attacks to something much more lucrative: renting out infected IoT devices as residential proxies. Brian Krebs reports that after hitting his site with a 6.3 terabit attack earlier this year, Isuru's operators are now selling access to over 700,000 compromised routers and cameras to proxy services. Security experts say that these are being heavily used for aggressive AI content scraping. Security experts say that these are being heavily used for aggressive AI content scraping. These are services that want to look like regular user traffic. I wonder how this relates to the report earlier this week that people had identified IoT devices that are now available via Tor. In other news, OpenAI just signed a massive deal of $38 billion with Amazon Web Services for cloud computing through 2032. According to Data Economy, the 7-year agreement will give OpenAI access to hundreds of thousands of NVIDIA GPUs and tens of millions of CPUs by the end of 2026. That's the technology news for November 4th, 2025, and if you're interested in any of these stories, I would encourage you to go see the show notes for more links. Okay, so for today's feature, we're going to talk about aviation. I've always had a fear of flying, and the official name for that is pteromechanophobia, but it's also known as aviophobia or aerophobia. And it's triggered by a bunch of factors. Some of it is, fear of crashing, fear of heights. I personally have claustrophobia, but I think it's also fundamentally a lack of control. You're put into a metal cylinder with about 100 or so other people, and you're just up there in the middle of the sky. It's terrifying for me. I'm also somewhere between 6'5" and 6'6", and for the rest of the world, that's about 200 centimeters tall. So when I happen to be in the middle seat of coach, I suffer from extreme discomfort. My knees hurt, I'm claustrophobic. I would rather be just about anywhere else in the world. But I'm also pathologically scared of flying. So the night before a flight, I will often check turbulence forecasts while checking the flight history for the flight I'm scheduled to take. I will also look at time series graphs of the altitude and speed of the last couple of flights, and flights that are near the flight I'm going to take. FlightAware has this amazing, terrible feature where you can see a graph of the altitude and speed over time. And when you see those bumps, that's when you know something was really turbulent. I also use a tool called Turbulence Forecast, which allows me to track PIREPs, or pilot reports of turbulence, and forecast models at different cruising altitudes. I remember once I got on a flight from Newark to Chicago, and it was a particularly stormy day. It was a very turbulent flight. I had an iPad with me that was ready with my whole itinerary, weather, flight path, turbulence potential check, and the person next to me in Economy Plus happened to be a pilot. After watching me go through the motions of checking FlightAware, flight turbulence, and the National Weather Service, he asked, "Hey, are you a pilot?" And I was like, "No, I just really hate turbulence." He sort of looked at me astonished, like, turbulence is not as bad as it feels. We talked about it for about a half an hour. He actually helped. But he also said at the end, "You look at more weather data than I look at when I'm in the cockpit of this airplane." I don't know if it's helping you, but it does. I actually have to treat my own fear of flying with something that clinicians call psychoeducation. It reduces my anxiety because I understand how it works. And more precisely, psychoeducation is teaching someone factual, technical, or procedural knowledge about the source of their anxiety, which, by the way, for me is everything. Other clinicians might call it cognitive restructuring. This is a cognitive behavioral therapy, a CBT technique, where you can replace irrational or catastrophic beliefs, like the plane is going to fall, with evidence-based or accurate information. The wings are designed to flex. Turbulence is not dangerous. And for the record, it's really not dangerous. So most of the time, I make it. And for a few years, I flew way more than almost everyone I worked with. I flew from Chicago to San Francisco once a week, sometimes twice a week, so I could get back for choir rehearsal on Wednesday nights. And I apologize for my carbon footprint. So when life demands it, I've found a way. But there are cases even now where if I see that a flight is going to be terribly turbulent, I'll move it. I'll switch to another day. I know my limits. I've experienced very severe turbulence, not extreme turbulence, but very severe turbulence. I didn't care for it. And I also had a front seat to aviation tragedy 24 years ago in Manhattan. So there's things that I fly with that I don't think a lot of other people have to, and that's a huge amount of fear. But there's one thing that's making it worse. This government shutdown that we're currently in the middle of, psychoeducation really is not helping me that much. Air traffic controllers are not being paid. Airports are starting to issue ground stops and even shutting down control towers at times. Many of us are going to have to fly during the holiday season if it's possible, and I guarantee you that I'll be sitting there thinking, who's minding the skies? I certainly hope that we reach some resolution for air traffic control issues before then. But here's the irony, and I know it. Statistically, flying is the safest thing you can do. It's safer than driving to the airport. I know this. You know this. The absurdity of modern aviation is that it's incredibly safe, thanks in large part to technology and rigorous engineering. So during that bad turbulence, the rational part of me whispers, trust the systems, trust the professionals, trust the automation. So on today's episode, I wanted to dig into that tension, trusting the autopilot, in both airplanes and in software. We have 3 sections today. First, we're going to explore why Airbus tells pilots to keep the autopilot on in rough air. And we're going to draw some parallels with how AI is starting to affect programmers. Then, I'm going to dive into FlightAware's famous misery map that visualizes our air travel pain. Lastly, I'm going to look at how air traffic control itself is or isn't being augmented by artificial intelligence here in 2025. So by the end of this episode, I hope you have a little bit more understanding about how automation is being used in aviation. So let's get started. All right, for our first segment, we're going to talk about autopilot in turbulence. Earlier this year, I was writing a lot about what some people call, quote, vibe coding. And for the record, I 100% hate that term because it doesn't feel like vibe coding when you really start to use tools like Cursor or GitHub Copilot. On the contrary, it is absolutely real work. There's nothing vibey about it. And the idea that these technologies have arrived to somehow allow a non-programmer to just, quote, vibe code, that could not be further from the truth. I prefer to call this thing that we're doing now with generative AI programming because it's the same thing. Let's drop the vibe from this term. Because if you start to really use these tools aggressively, if you start to ask Sonnet, Gemini, ChatGPT, or Opus, not just to write a simple little 3D game that you're going to show when you announce a new model, but to analyze APIs, to give you opinions, to look at a software package before you release it, say, help me find the things I've missed. Help me analyze the security of this software. You can often ask it to come up with several architectural proposals at once, and then you can combine those into one prompt that compares them to each other and gives you pros and cons of each. But all of that requires you as a programmer to be the pilot. And the irony of all of this discussion about job loss and AI is that generative AI and programming, it requires more qualified developers than we had before we were using generative AI. You see, generative AI isn't going to make programming easier as much as it's going to increase the level of difficulty for the problems that we're going to be able to solve. Like Dijkstra said in 1972, 53 years ago, programming is very difficult, and it will remain so. So as I was looking into those stories, I stumbled upon a manual that Airbus sends to its pilots of the 320. And I should probably get a better hobby than reading pilot manuals, but I found it interesting that Airbus explicitly tells pilots, don't touch autopilot during turbulence. It's going to be able to handle it better than you ever could. And that's been happening for 20 years, as far as I can see. So I wanted to find out more. Airbus didn't arrive at this, keep the autopilot on in turbulence by instinct or marketing. They arrived at that conclusion by data, simulator trials, and decades of fly-by-wire engineering. Their internal safety magazine lays it out plainly. When bumps hit, pilots should resist the reflex to grab the stick and instead let automation ride it out. They're only told to step in if protections trigger or if a situation deteriorates. That same stance dates back to at least 2005. So again, they've been doing this for 20 years. And as a programmer, as someone who's in a profession that is now starting to see more autopilot presence, I want to understand how this happened. So how did they reach this conclusion? First, they looked at a lot of flights. They found patterns. Airbus analyzed operator flight data monitoring, FDM sets, covering 1 million flights. And they found a very specific finding. Temporary overspeed, brushing against that maximum speed, happens roughly once every 1,400 flights, usually in cruise when winds change. In a quarter of those cases, pilots disconnected the autopilot, sometimes making abrupt inputs that produced unnecessary altitude deviations. Airbus's recommendation came out of this. In cruise overspeed scenarios, keep the autopilot. And this runs against a lot of pilot lore and a lot of pilot history. A lot of pilots think, oh, I'm going to take over. It's getting tough. I'm going to do yank and bank. I'm going to manually fix this airplane. But leaving the autopilot on and accepting small deviations, avoid chasing that needle except when something goes seriously awry. And I think the meta conclusion is the data beats the gut feel. Some of the pilots who took over, some of the pilots who turned over autopilot were like, I got this. Don't worry. We're going to hit turbulence. I got this. No problem. But in reality, what they found through millions of flights is, no, they don't. So one of the questions I have is because I have to know everything, right? I have psycho-educational needs that we talked about in the intro. I want to demystify what is autopilot? How is it working? To me, it's just magic. On an Airbus 320 family, autopilot is not just a single box. It's not like a computer that's sitting there and making decisions. It's a stack. It's flight control computers. It's air data inertial sources. There's something called an FMS or an FG. It fuses data. It applies control laws that command G, or gravity, and rate targets, rather than raw surface deflection. So it's not actually just looking at the wings. It's looking at everything. In normal law, the pitch is essentially a 1G flight path rate demand. And I'll translate that. Autopilot is there to make sure that you're not being jerked up and down. You don't feel like you're going up a roller coaster or down a roller coaster. You're not rolling or banking 30 or 40 degrees in either direction. It's there to make sure that the flight is stable. How many variables is this thing watching? A lot. Regulatory minimums for modern transport require up to 88 distinct parameters. And I'm not going to overwhelm you with acronyms, but there are quite a bit here. There's sampling rate intervals for things like airspeed, Mach, pitch, roll, heading, acceleration, selected speed versus actual speed, altitude, selected Mach, autopilot engagement state, thrust, surfaces. The AP and flight control computers are continuously consuming these same classes of inputs, and they're reacting to it. And just to make an analogy that'll make this easier to understand, I'm recording this on a MacBook. I'm speaking into a microphone, it's routing it to Logic Pro, and I have filters like limiters, de-essers, compressors, and it's doing not something dissimilar from what an airplane is doing to flight data. It's looking at the flight data, it's looking at the plan, it's making immediate decisions about what to do. And it's tracking so many inputs, it would be difficult for a human to equal that. There's also redundancy. An A320 has 3 air reference data computers, 3 angle of attack probes. These computers aren't just independently measuring data, they're comparing notes and rejecting outliers. Crosswind, icing cases, all of these things are being tracked by the computer. So it's this level of redundancy coupled with the number of variables that are being monitored and the fly-by-wire approach. The computer is going to be able to handle a flaky sensor or a wind gradient surprise better because there's just too much data to consume. And frankly, as a passenger, I'd prefer this rather than someone saying, I got this, I'm going to fly it on feeling. So there were 3 things in particular that Airbus found after looking at 1 million flights, and one is ground speed on approach. So if you're in an airplane and you're landing on a gusty day, you've got systems that are watching headwind. And if headwind drops, there's some speed issues that might happen, especially when you're going to flare the wings up. Autopilot's taking care of that. Overspeed. If you're going on cruise altitude and you're approaching your speed max and turbulence hits and some wind starts to push you beyond that limit, Airbus is going to automatically nose up to control that. And also on low speed, it's going to find your bank, your pitch, your load factor, and it's going to make that low speed a little bit less turbulent. And that's automatic. That's being done in real time. Now, I 100% expect a couple pilots listening to this will respond to me and say, you got it all wrong. I can do better than this autopilot. And I don't dispute that. I think Boeing has less of a fly-by-wire approach, and you're more likely on a Boeing plane to have a pilot take over. But let's talk about the human factors. Let's talk about some of the things that went into this study, and that is humans have startle and cognitive bandwidth issues. So a sudden jolt impairs information processing and decision quality. Research and regulator guidance cites effects that can last many seconds, even tens of seconds, which is more than enough time to make a hard problem worse. Also, manual overcontrol is common. Airbus's flight data review found manual autopilot disconnect in about 25% of overspeed events and documented abrupt inputs leading to unnecessary altitude excursions, exactly what the protections are trying to prevent. The machine isn't better than the pilot. I don't want to say that. We still need a pilot. It's just a different kind of pilot. One that's able to read dozens of event streams. One that's able to look at outliers in terms of sensor data. And it's not going to get startled. The smartest move in most bumps is to let that autopilot work while the human stays ahead of the next decision. So I just want to note that I've been focusing on Airbus, and Airbus has a fly-by-wire philosophy. And it grew from a very particular vision that digital fly-by-wire keeps the airplane inside a safe envelope. Bernard Ziegler, Airbus's pioneering test pilot and engineering leader, he pushed this world's first fly-by-wire approach into commercial service with the A320 in 1988. And the core idea was that computers interpret the pilot's intent, G and rate demands, and they'll refuse to follow a command that would break the airplane or leave the aerodynamic envelope. And just to explain that, the aerodynamic envelope is essentially the space in which the airplane is going to continue to stay in the sky. And to bring this back to the topic of this overall podcast, there's a bit of a personality pattern here that jet pilots share with programmers. Jet pilots are trained to take responsibility. The buck stops with them. Programmers are also trained to take ownership of the code that they write. Both can bristle at letting the computer drive. But in aviation, that data made the case first. And it was decades ago. And the procedures followed. Keep the autopilot on through turbulence. Intervene deliberately, not reflexively. Software is starting to head in that same direction. The craft doesn't go away. Judgment becomes the craft. But we are going to have to start letting the system handle the more boring, bumpy physics. So if you're like me and looking around and trying to figure out how to talk to your new AI copilot, this is something that you should look into. How did aviation handle it? And it's been decades, and they're now used to it. And again, I completely expect there to be a Boeing versus Airbus argument in a comment thread somewhere in response to this podcast. And there are some people who argue that fly-by-wire isn't perfect. I'm not going to say it's perfect, but I would argue this. If you get on an Airbus 320, that pilot still feels like a pilot. That pilot doesn't just feel like they're there to watch the autopilot, because we still 100% depend on a human being to be present. And honestly, I hope that doesn't change. Okay, in segment 2, we're going to talk about Misery Map, tracking turbulence on the ground. So speaking of turbulence, let's talk about the kind that happens at the airport rather than in the sky. If you were traveling during the shutdown, or honestly any busy travel time with bad weather, you've probably experienced this special kind of misery: delayed flights, cancellations, long wait times, and general chaos. It turns out that someone has actually made a map for that. It's called the Misery Map. And it really is called a misery map. It's one of my favorite examples of turning real-time data into something that you can viscerally understand in seconds. When things go wrong in air travel, misery loves company. And this map shows you exactly how much company you have. So the FlightAware Misery Map is this real-time visualization that shows flight delays and cancellations across major US airports. Green segments indicate the percentage of flights on time, while red segments indicate misery, delayed or canceled flights. It integrates weather overlays and even allows time-lapse playback to see how the misery has evolved over the past 48 hours. And this is often the first thing I personally check on a day of travel, because it allows me to see what my day is going to be like. Am I going to be miserable? And if you haven't seen FlightAware's Misery Map, you should go check it out. It's basically the United States, and there's 17 big hub airports, actually cities. There's one pie chart for New York. There's a pie chart for Boston. There's a pie chart for DC. There's a pie chart for Seattle. And if you look at it, you look at these circles. And if it's mostly red, you know it's a bad day. If you mouse over Chicago, it'll tell you like O'Hare has 120 delays, 30 cancellations. And when those lines turn red or green, it also shows you, when you mouse over a city, the routes. So you can see like, oh, the connection between Chicago and Houston is red today. So there's problems. And you can also see thunderstorm impact. So if there's a thunderstorm over New York, that New York pie chart is going to look pretty red. But it's comforting. It's comforting because you look at it, you're in an airport, it's awful. It feels better to know you're not the only one suffering through continent-wide misery. So this tool's been around for a while. You might have heard about it in the news. During the recent federal government shutdown, Misery Map has been the thing that most news organizations talk about whenever they're talking about air traffic control disruptions. In early October, when the controller staffing issues were causing delays coast to coast, total daily delays and cancellations were averaging around 5,000 flights a day for several days in a row. This wasn't just weather, it was understaffing. The FAA even had a reduced flight volume at some airports because there simply were not enough controllers on duty. And this problem continues when Hollywood's Burbank control tower shut down entirely one afternoon, and this actually happened. It left pilots to self-coordinate landings like it was a little municipal airstrip. So this is all bad news for flyers, but it's good news for the Misery Map. The Misery Map's time has arrived because it's very relevant every single day. Now, being the tech-curious person I am, I'm equally fascinated by how this all works behind the scenes. FlightAware, the company that makes Misery Map and many other flight tracking tools, it's sitting on a gold mine of aviation data. They started years ago by tapping into FAA feeds, and they've since grown into a beast that fuses data from thousands of sources worldwide. We're talking air traffic control data from multiple countries, airline data. They have a huge network of sensors for tracking the planes. There's a little receiver called ADS-B. It's a receiver that you can run yourself. They have crowdsourced about 30,000 of these ground stations. You could run one and sign up, but they also integrate with satellite-based ADS-B for coverage over oceans. They ingest official data, commercial data, crowdsourced data. So if you're looking for data about where a flight is, go to FlightAware. So they get about 1,000 messages a second. At least this is what's documented. They have something called Hyperfeed engine, and it's sitting there gobbling up all this information and creating those maps. The system applies models and algorithms to reconcile discrepancies. For example, if one source says a plane is here and another says it's there, it figures out the truth, it fills in the gaps. So they have an extremely accurate tracking and delay info, they have commercial products, they have an API. But when it comes to the visualization itself, it's essentially a real-time web application. It calls on all that process data. The map part is very interesting. FlightAware used to be mostly traditional web maps, raster tiles, but they modernized it. They've talked on their engineering blog, but also on Hacker News about how they moved to vector-based maps with OpenStreetMap data, and they use technologies like open layers in the browser. The planes and the transport data are drawn as vector overlays, meaning that instead of just static images, your browser is actually receiving the data and rendering it. And there's so much data on their maps, they've had to come up with novel ways to come up with a tiling system to break the world into different grids and only send the relevant slice of data to your browser. So there's a lot of technical detail. There's some links in the show notes. If you're more interested in how Misery Map works, which I am, that might be useful. But once again, I'm doing this segment because I'm hearing a lot about Misery Map. I depend on it, but I've never really stopped to figure out how does this thing work. And the other thing to know is they have APIs. If you don't feel like Misery Map really captures your personal sense of misery, you can go sign up for their API. They have a commercial API called Arrow API. They have a streaming feed called Firehose. And if you're an airline or an app developer, you can tap into that same data. You can make your own customized Misery Map. I might do that. It's also worth noting that Misery Map is not open source. This is all commercial. It's proprietary. But it's an important story, and it's something where if you really want to do some customization, it's all out there for you to take advantage of it. And so the next time you're stuck in an airport and you're being told that your airplane's late or it's going to be canceled, go fire up Misery Map and know that there's a great deal of technology fueling that map that'll make you feel miserable. Okay, segment 3, AI in air traffic control augmenting the humans in the tower. So if the thought of turning on autopilot in turbulence makes some pilots nervous, imagine the reaction to the idea of autopilot for air traffic control. Running air traffic control is often described as one of the most demanding, high-stakes jobs out there. You've got these men and women in towers and radar rooms, eyes on screen, moving blips, orchestrating a giant 3D puzzle of metal tubes flying at 500 miles an hour, full of people like me worrying. It's maybe one of the most intense jobs available, and it relies on human judgment, experience, and split-second decision-making. In the US, we've also had a shortage of controllers, a problem that was only exacerbated by the government shutdown. One fun stat for you, by late October, something like 8,000 flights in a single day were delayed partly due to ATC staffing issues. In recent news, we've even had union officials for air traffic controllers pleading, please don't do stickouts, as exhaustion starts to set in. So naturally, in 2025, people are starting to ask, can't we use AI or automation to help? Maybe take some of that load off of these humans, or even, for the especially optimistic or naive, replace them. After all, if we have self-driving cars, and that's debatable, or autopilots that can basically land planes, why not just have an AI air traffic controller managing a sector of airspace? Well, buckle up, because this is a controversial and fascinating area. 2025 has seen a lot of talk and a bit of action about AI in air traffic control, but it's far from a done deal. First, I want to start with the pushback, because there has been plenty. A lot of seasoned aviation folks hear, quote, AI controlling aircraft, and they immediately shake their heads and say, nope, it's almost an instinct. There's a quote from Patrick Arnzen, the CEO of a flight training organization that stuck with me. He said, quote, it takes years to develop that instinct to really understand how to do this job. AI can't simply react quickly enough to handle it. In other words, managing air traffic isn't just about rules and patterns. It's an almost gut-level ability to anticipate and respond in a fluid, complex environment, something he doubts an AI can replicate anytime soon. And Arnzen isn't some Luddite. He actually says he's not against AI in principle. He's just weary of applying it in such a high-stakes domain without serious caution. He also pointed out a very pragmatic obstacle, regulation. Quoting Arnzen again, in the aviation world, everything we do is wrapped in heavy regulation, he noted. And even if the AI system is theoretically capable, you can't just deploy it without regulatory frameworks catching up. This is true. Even if tomorrow someone invented an AI that could potentially manage traffic perfectly, getting it certified and trusted in the national airspace might take years. Meanwhile, our radar scopes and comm systems in many towers are running on tech from the 1990s or earlier. Some towers literally still use paper flight strips, so the infrastructure isn't exactly plug and play for a cutting-edge AI solution. That said, we are seeing AI creep in around the edges of air traffic control, primarily as assistive technology. Most controllers today already use some automated tools and decision aids. For example, there are conflict alert systems that beep if two planes might get too close, or sequencing tools that help line up aircraft for approaches. These have been around for decades. But there's a new wave of tools that are making these smarter and more predictive with AI. A piece I read from Vaughan College nicely summarized the areas where AI can slot in to boost air traffic control without replacing humans. First are decision support systems. These are AIs that analyze heaps of data in real time to give controllers suggestions or insights. Think of it like a super intelligent advisor whispering, hey, that route you gave Flight 95 might encounter congestion, consider an alternate, or highlighting an anomaly that a human might miss. The other area is automated conflict detection. So this has already been around for a couple of decades in simpler forms. But with AI, it can start to predict potential conflicts further ahead and even suggest specific avoidance maneuvers, continuously monitoring thousands of trajectories at once. There's traffic prediction and flow management. AI can chew through historical and real-time data to predict how traffic patterns will evolve in the next few hours. It can optimize routes. It can space routes to reduce bottlenecks. And now some of this happens right now, right? We're already doing this. I've been on planes and been told we have to wait 6 minutes because there's a spacing issue in LaGuardia. But what AI is starting to jump in and maybe provide is a more predictive capability. It can look at emerging weather patterns. It can look at historical traffic patterns. And there's a lot of opportunity here for interesting things to happen. So remember, in the previous segment, I talked about how FlightAware gets 10,000 events per second, and that's a pretty high volume of events. That's all of the airplanes in the world, sending their altitude, sending their speed. There's other things that we could measure, like maintenance status. One thing that you'll see if you keep track of aviation, especially turbulence, is that there's this really old-fashioned thing called a pilot report. And if you really want to see where the severe and extreme turbulence is, you go look at the PIREP report, pilot reports. And this is where a pilot can literally radio in, I just had a severe turbulence event. This was the altitude. This is my speed. They give a little bit of a description about what it is. Now think about with AI and with the ability to fuse all this data at once, you could have something that's doing a more intelligent air traffic control that doesn't have to wait for pilots to tell it that it just experienced the worst turbulence ever. So getting more proactive about fusing all this data together, that could be very promising. Because right now, if you're the kind of flyer that used to listen to Channel 9 on United, like me, of course, when flying gets interesting, those radio channels get busy and you've got pilots manually reporting that there's turbulence in certain areas. If we could hook all that airplane data up to something that could make routing adjustments automatically, that might be a good thing. And the other thing where AI is starting to maybe make itself known is transcribing and understanding pilot and controller communications. And so this is interesting because it's already starting in some places to provide a backup, to make sure that it's clarifying for the controller what someone said, and it's identifying areas where there might be a miscommunication. And again, if you ever are the kind of person that used to listen to United's Channel 9 and you used to listen to the back and forth between controllers and pilots, every once in a while, you would hear something and you'd be like, I cannot believe they just had an interaction that was that rude or that inappropriate. So getting AI involved in this might be interesting. It might get in front of the fact that I've seen a lot of YouTube videos about controllers for LaGuardia being extremely abrupt with pilots. Again, for the record, I don't think it was their fault. I think they had to deal with some pilots who did not know how to fly planes. Okay, so there are some other things happening. At Heathrow, one of the busiest airports in the world, there's an AI system called AMEE. That's AIMEE. It interprets pilot requests, and sometimes it handles routine clearances. So if all the conditions are met, it can issue a standard clearance without a human having to push the button and speak. It's kind of like a little helper handling the repetitive stuff so that controllers can focus on complex tasks. And to be clear, I don't know if a human has to press the button or if it can just issue the clearance. I am hoping that a human still has to press that button. So this AI system was developed by Sea Ridge Technologies, and it's starting to aid controllers in insanely congested airspace. It's not just like a robot that's sitting there and like looking at the screens. It's integrating sensor data, radar data, video feeds. It's creating a comprehensive picture. One of the coolest features is that computer vision. It looks at the camera feeds around the airport, and it can identify and track the aircraft. In the past, controllers would have to manually fiddle with cameras, but now we have an AI that's auto-steering the cameras to keep an eye on that craft. In particular, it's also enhancing situational awareness. It cross-checks what it sees and hears. It can listen to radio calls using natural language processing, and it can verify that against the data. If a pilot says cleared for takeoff and it wasn't actually cleared, this AI system might actually catch that discrepancy. So just like pilots in the cockpit, if there's a low altitude condition, you'll hear a voice. We could actually start hearing automated voices for taxiing airplanes. Like, no, incorrect, you are not cleared for takeoff. It's going to be very interesting to see how this develops. But again, I hope that the humans are still there. On the other side of the pond, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, has been taking baby steps. They've been notably cautious, and rightly so. As of mid-2025, one concrete thing we saw is that the FAA made a small contract to get access to OpenAI through Azure, basically experimenting with GPT-5, Whisper, DALL-E. That price tag was only $80,000, which in government terms is like the price of a copier, and this suggests it was just exploratory. The agency openly said it wasn't using ChatGPT in any operations as of 2023. It was only looking at AI for things like code writing assistance and answering questions about safety reports. For example, they used an LLM to help answer queries on aviation incident reports, likely a way to quickly summarize findings and pull relevant info. The FAA also published a research roadmap for AI safety assurance, indicating that they're examining how to certify and trust AI in various roles. So while the cockpit is very used to automation, we're still not seeing a lot of it in air traffic control. We don't have RoboController 3000 automatically talking to a robot on the airplane managing that flight into JFK. That's not now, that's not next year. We do have an industry and a government starting to think about where this fits so they can shore up the gaps. And there are a lot of gaps. Aging systems, staff shortages, and right now, staff that isn't even being paid. And increasing air traffic demand. More people are flying. Even the most skeptical voices agree that AI could be useful for things like training, for things like augmenting human attention, and handling more of the data behind the scenes so that they can simplify a controller's job. We also see AI being welcomed into adjacent areas, for example, airport operations, not just the air traffic control part. They're all using AI for scheduling gate assignments, directing ground vehicles, security scanning. Some airports are essentially giant data farms now, with AI optimizing everything from ventilation systems to the movement of queues. It's not directly air traffic control, but it contributes to the overall efficiency of air travel. And I think the most important thing to talk about is the jobs. Every controller I've heard speak on this says something along the lines of, AI can be helpful, but it's not replacing us. The National Air Traffic Controllers Association, NATCA, has been very vocal about the need to hire and train more controllers. They likely view any promise of AI as a supplement, but not as a staffing solution. Maybe in 2035, a controller's job will be 50% monitoring automated systems and 50% handling the edge cases, whereas in 2005, it's 90% directing, controlling, and 10% automation. But that's still a highly skilled human in the loop. Just like in that cockpit, even on an Airbus 320, there's still a pilot at the controls. But there's also the matter of public perception and safety. If a car driven by AI crashes, it makes headlines and we have debates. Imagine an AI-related mishap in air traffic control. The stakes are just way too high to rush this. And I'll throw in a personal perspective at the end here. As a frequent flyer and a tech geek, I want AI to help make flying smoother and safer. If an AI can catch a mistake that a tired controller might miss, that's fantastic. If it can shave 5 minutes off my taxi time by optimizing departures, I'll take it. But I also take immense comfort in knowing that there's a human being, a dedicated professional, at the helm of ATC, who will make the tough calls when things get hairy. We've had a few near-miss incidents on runways this year in the US alone, and in each case, it was human vigilance and procedure that prevented disaster. Could AI have prevented these situations altogether? Maybe, by stricter monitoring or by not getting tired in the first place. But I still want a human there as a last line of defense. The goal then is to combine them. Let AI augment that human expertise, that human vigilance, not replace it. Give the controllers Iron Man-esque super tools, but still acknowledge that Tony Stark was still inside that suit. And in closing, I want to relate it back to technology because this is a podcast focused on programming. For those of you who have been using generative AI to write code, you are very familiar with the idea that these models are both amazing in what they can produce, but they are also very capable of leading people down the wrong paths if you don't pay attention. You can use the best, most expensive models out there, the Opus 4.1 or the GTP 5 Pro, But if a human isn't paying close attention, it's easy for your code to deviate from that plan. And so the trick is figuring out where those boundaries are. What are the machines good at? Where do they fall short? Where do humans need to stay in control? And what should we happily hand over with proper oversight? Because the machines truly can do some things much faster and at a higher quality than we're ever going to be able to do. And just like Airbus telling its pilots to let Autopilot handle the turbulence, I can see a future in which the controllers know the models are better at identifying dangerous edge cases than they are. We'll see. It's clear that 2025 has not been the year that AI is going to take over air traffic control. It's been a year of serious conversations about it. And as those of us in tech figure out what generative AI is good at and what it isn't, we're seeing aviation do the same soul searching. It's the early days, but I'm optimistic that the outcome will be positive. Fewer flight delays, safer skies, maybe even a less stressed out Tim sitting on his next flight. And if a day comes that an AI is managing our skies, maybe my fear of flying will ease a bit, knowing that it's not calling in sick or working several unpaid overtime shifts in a row. Or maybe I'll just find something else to worry about so I can write more episodes of this podcast. As we're all figuring out what generative AI is good at and what it isn't good at, let's hope our air traffic controllers are not vibe controlling.